I'm Jason Spingarn-Koff. I'm a professor of journalism and the Knight Chair in Climate Journalism at UC Berkeley. And we're gathered here today because we all care about the fate of the oceans and with it, the fate of our planet. The ocean covers 70% of the surface of the Earth, and 40% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of the coast. Our well-being depends on a healthy ocean. As the 2022 UN Oceans Conference declared, the ocean is fundamental to life on our planet and to our future. It's a key source of biodiversity, plays a vital role in the climate system and water cycle, supplies oxygen we breathe and food we eat, provides jobs and enables free trade, and is an important part of our cultural heritage. Western science is one of the various ways of knowing about the ocean, in addition to longstanding indigenous knowledge. As the great marine biologist Sylvia Earle has said, more has been discovered about the nature of the ocean in the past century than during all preceding history. And there's still so much more to learn. Something we've discovered, which becomes more clear every day, is that the ocean and coastal communities are under threat in an age of rapid climate change. The ocean absorbs an estimated 91% of heat from global warming. This can be devastating. In the summer of 2023 and throughout 2024, there was the world's worst marine heat wave, which caused a global bleaching event of coral reefs, affecting 3/4 of the world's reefs. And we're going to discuss this more later today. The warming also melts ice, causing seas to rise. And the impacts of this are compounded by extreme storms, which erode California coastlines and wash out homes. Today, we're going to learn about some of the impacts of this in the Bay Area. Plastic pollution in our oceans is contributing to the decline of marine species and the destruction of ecosystems, as this waste compromises 80% of all marine pollution. Research states that by 2050, plastic will likely outweigh all fish in the sea. The facts are heavy, sometimes unbearably so, and sometimes the facts make us feel impotent, especially at this time in our country's history. In fact, that's the heart of why we're here, at the intersection of science and journalism, of hope and despair, to grapple with these questions. How can we bring the brightest minds together across disciplines to address these kinds of challenges? How do we inform the public so communities know what's at stake? How do we tell this story so that people come together to act rather than retreat from the challenge? Some of the people gathered here today are at the forefront of this vital work. We've assembled scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, filmmakers, and journalists who've come as far as China and Jamaica. As we begin to answer these questions and learn from each other, my hope is that we can drive positive action for a healthier planet. Author and activist Rebecca Solnit said, "Change is not always a force we can control or predict. It's often the result of countless small actions and shifts coming together." Thank you all for coming together today for small actions that can add up to big shifts for our ocean and planet. We've planned an exciting afternoon of lightning talks and panels that will explore how the ocean impacts our lives and the world around us, from the crucial role in sustaining coastal communities and driving economic opportunities to the urgent need for conservation. We will dive into the complex challenges our oceans face today. Throughout the symposium, we'll hear from scientists and journalists and ocean stewards working at the forefront of ocean science and conservation, and storytelling to inspire positive action and drive solutions. Before jumping in, I want to thank the Pulitzer Center for supporting today's event, and the Berkeley Journalism staff and students who helped make all this possible. And thank you for your presence today, for your passion and expertise, and for your collaborative spirit. I'm now pleased to introduce our first session of the day, Communities on the Edge, Coastal Adaptation and Climate Change, a look at how coastal communities are responding and adapting to threats like sea level rise, extreme weather, and declining biodiversity. Our speakers include Gladstone Taylor, an author, journalist, and Pulitzer Center grantee from Kingston, Jamaica, who writes about coastal resilience in island communities. Zachary Lamb, UC Berkeley urban planner, co-author of a study that examines climate change impacts on property in the Bay Area. And Rachel Carlson, UC Berkeley coastal ecologist, who studies the effects of climate change on nearshore organisms and livelihoods. Mark Schapiro, my colleague and an award-winning investigative journalist and author who specializes in the environment, will then moderate a brief panel discussion. To begin, please welcome Gladstone Taylor.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Jason, for that gracious introduction. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center for having us here today. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from everyone else as well, because even though I am here to share my work, I'm also here as a fan of ocean reporting, science journalism. So I'm going to start with just a bit kind of what Jason was saying earlier, which is that the world's oceans are a collective resource, but unfortunately our behavior towards them tends to be selfish. Thanks to a long storied history of this behavior, we have been able to observe through science a depletion of the resource. From bleaching corals, biomass decrease, keystone species endangerment, to ocean acidification, and I could continue on. As a result, small islands like Jamaica, for those who know about the Caribbean region, and other island regions whose main territories are all coastal, they experience disproportionate effects. My reporting reveals a severe decline in Jamaica's marine resources due to pollution, overfishing, climate change, and ecosystem collapse. So this is a small island dilemma. Some of the symptoms, I don't want to kind of read everything, but I'll just touch on a few start points. So 98% of long-spined urchins, or Diadema antillarum, were wiped out in a 1983 disease outbreak in the Caribbean. In 2022, another disease outbreak spread across at least 25 Caribbean jurisdictions, further reducing the urchin population. We'll get a bit more into what people are doing to try to solve some of this locally. But the sea urchins are extremely important. In other regions, sea urchins graze on kelp. In some of those regions, they're overgrazing, which is in turn also bad for the environment. So there are people there who are trying to help with those things. Locally in Jamaica, because we don't necessarily have kelp, we have an ecosystem of coral that's declining a little bit, or has been declining for some time. A big part of the balance in that ecosystem is the sea urchin. They graze on the algae. Now, without a proper balance of algae and coral, you'll have more dying off of corals, more suffocating of corals, and without corals, as we know, that's where the fish breed, that's where they live, and that results in a decrease of the fish population as well. Biomass reduction, as I've said. But there's also things like policy breakdown. So one of my first stories reporting on the environment was a story about fisheries subsidies. Locally in Jamaica, most of our fishers are artisan fishers or artisanal fishers, which means they don't use, I don't know if you guys have ever watched Big Catch and seen those big ships with the big rigs and the big gears, those commercial fleets and that kind of thing. We do not have that in Jamaica. Our fishers very much use rods, lines, and those kinds of things, and they go out in much like some of these boats that you can see in the background, motorboats. So this policy with subsidies, it ensures that for every $1 in fishing subsidies given to small island and developing states like Jamaica, industrialized nations spend $7, and that's the fund that they give to their fishing industries. This means that these already well-equipped vessels can go further, they can fish more. Oftentimes they end up in our waters, contributing to the overfishing that we are already doing. This makes life harder for people living on the coast communities, fishers especially, who they're having to go further out to sea to catch because nearshore waters are overfished. The population is very small. So nowadays what I find, and this is, I have family who are fishers as well, where once they could, fishing trips would be maybe, or going out to fish would maybe be half a day. Now these trips are turning into sometimes 3-day trips, sometimes week-long trips, because that's how far they have to go. So that's a really big impact that policy breakdown sometimes has on these kinds of things. The climate-driven crisis itself, 13 million tons of sargassum seaweed covered the Atlantic by March 2023, a record-breaking bloom linked to climate change. For Jamaica, and we saw the documentary about seaweed and its importance. Sargassum is also a seaweed. Unfortunately, during the breakdown of sargassum, there are substances that can be harmful to the environment. So when climate change forces these extra blooms, they wash up on our shores, inundate them. Sometimes it's bad. It's bad for the fisheries, but it's also bad for our coastal resources. So tourist things like beaches and that kind of thing, there's a really big impact there. But luckily, and like Jason mentioned, this subject is, when we talk about environmental reporting, climate change, solutions and this kind of thing, it is an intersection between hope and despair. But there is a silver line. The human spirit is very resilient. And on my reports, going out to find some of these solutions that some communities and organizations are, coming together to present, I've found people, individuals, more importantly, who, when you hear from them, and because sometimes some of these statistics about how things are declining, these resources are declining, can cause despair. But these people are hopeful. They live with hope because they are working on that solution every day. Their job is to do that. So conservation efforts, marine sanctuaries, mangrove restoration, and sustainable fisheries are showing signs of recovery where they're implemented. And this is one of the places where I had a little bit of struggle because sometimes you need, and the sanctuaries themselves, the conservation areas, they need statistics about how these things, the impact of these things, to keep running. So I had a bit of a challenge in certain areas. But I did find that wherever they were implemented, there was a return, or in some fish, there was an increase in the biomass and these kinds of things. So they are having an impact. Between 2013 and 2020, Jamaica's fish population increased 5-fold in areas where marine sanctuaries are proving their effectiveness. Now, I mentioned some of the heroes can see some pictures here. I'm a multimedia journalist, so I take photos and I do videos as well. On the top right here, you'll find the manager of one of the sanctuaries, some volunteers from the community. That's the White River Fish Sanctuary. That is a warden, right? Now, this is a very interesting case. The photo in the middle with the gentleman in the blue under the fish sanctuary sign. Now, this part is important because it's the fishers who are struggling that these groups are putting in place to become the wardens, to safeguard these sanctuaries and these protected areas. And then you can see on the left over, well, it's more important. It's important because they are the ones that have been on the forefront of these environments for years and years with traditional knowledge about these things passing down. So, you know, they definitely, if they're not the ones most ideal or most suited or most qualified, then I don't know who is. But over there you can see it's a picture of a tarpon, which the Orocabessa Fish Sanctuary, this gentleman in the middle here, the Golden Eye Foundation, which is he's the manager of a foundation of a hotel, and they're collaborating with fishers. They're collaborating with the community to, you know, run these sanctuaries. I visited a couple of them. The one where the tarpon is, it's literally where the dock is. You could go out on the pier and you'll see these fish. They're huge, and it's something that was not there before the sanctuary. So we're seeing we're definitely seeing a return. Sometimes the fish migrate as well when they find that the coastal environment isn't as nourishing as it used to be. So yeah, we definitely have evidence of them coming back in these particular areas where conservation is taking place. But there are other solutions as well outside of sanctuaries. This solution in particular, the Kingston Harbor cleanup, I don't need to kind of reiterate those stats, but we have a great deal of pollution, especially in cities where they're by the coast or they have a port, and there tends to be river outlets or drainages. Just for better drainage in urban planning, those are the outlets where a lot of the pollution enters our oceans. And so this particular solution, the Kingston Harbor cleanup, is a joint effort between our ocean. Yeah, so it's a joint effort between the Kingston Harbor cleanup is a local it's a local entity, but they're also partnering with a global entity, the ocean cleanup, which you can see here. They have an interceptor. You can kind of see some of what's going on there. So there are solutions like that as well, and all of these take collaboration. There are more solutions. Sea urchin nurseries, you can kind of see some of them there. Individuals involved as well. There's a video here with an urchin kind of eating, and that's something that many people have never seen. So, that helped a bit in my story. There are a lot of other things. This is a mangrove sanctuary where, if we know about mangroves, they sequester carbon, so they're extremely important. And yeah, there's a lot more going on, but yeah, this is just some of it. I did an extensive, a great deal of reporting, but yeah, these are just some of the top ones that kind of stood out to me. But yeah. That's it for me. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm happy to share more in the question and answer section.
There we are. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure, and this is a different kind of audience and expertise than I'm typically engaged with, so I'm really excited to be a part of it. So the work I'm going to talk about today is this report called Bayshore Urbanism, Property and Climate Change Adaptation on San Francisco Bay. It was done in collaboration with colleague Rob Wolshansky. It was supported by Next 10, which is a small foundation in the region here that supports a lot of climate-related work. And what we're focused on here is the role of property and property institutions in particular in shaping adaptation. And so there's been tons of recent research and really excellent advocacy work recently to point out the scale of impacts that we're expecting from climate change, and in particular from sea level rise on the Bay in Bayside communities, including kind of enumerating the size of the investments necessary to protect Bayside communities, through various kinds of infrastructure investments. And what we were interested in looking at here was not so much those questions as the question of all of the many thousands of individual decisions that are going to drive adaptation decision-making around the Bay by those people who own and control property. And so we were thinking about what are the ways that property institutions, our existing kind of dominant property institutions, shape vulnerability and then will also shape adaptation. And I think, we were mostly thinking about this from a planning and sort of uneven impacts of climate change perspective on human communities, but I think there's some really important implications for the aquatic ecosystems as well. So I'd be excited to think more about that with those of you in the room. But so fundamentally, we see the sort of three major problems with the kind of dominant property regimes around the Bay and across much of the kind of Western industrialized world, frankly, which is that dominant property regimes are rigid, right? So that we have fixed boundaries on the land. They're fragmenting and fragmented, meaning that we divide up the earth into sort of discrete little pieces of landscape, and they're deeply unjust, right? So they're implicated in generations deep patterns of unjust and uneven wealth accumulation along lines of race and class and gender, among others. And so we're interested in thinking through these three challenges that we see as associated with those kind of fundamental characters of dominant property regimes. So how can we go from static property regimes and land governance to more flexible regimes? How can we go from fragmentation to regimes of property governance that enable collective action? And then how can we really begin to grapple with the unjust legacies of our inherited property regimes? And so that was sort of our starting point. And the good news is that there are tons and tons of models around the world of other ways of governing land together that are more flexible, that are more adaptable to changing environmental conditions and landscape conditions, and that are more tuned towards equitable solutions. And so in the report, we go into great detail on a number of these kinds of strategies. And for today, I'll just kind of mention a few briefly, but if you're interested in discussing more, I'm happy to get into it. So we talk about strategies for moving property rights, right? So there are strategies like rolling easements and land readjustment and transfer of development rights schemes. We also look at existing property regimes around the Bay, in particular, in looking at what we're looking at here is an analysis of parts of Alameda County, where we're looking at how much of the area that's subject to projected sea level rise at 96 inches of sea level rise is held by different kinds of entities, right? So we found that over 53% of the land area projected to be inundated with that kind of sea level rise is held by public entities, right? So by parks districts and port authorities and utilities and all those kinds of entities. But then we were also actually really surprised to see these other two parts of the pie graphs here, which are that 45% of the residential parcels that are in the inundation zone and 85% of the residential area are actually held in institutions that are of shared private governance. And so what we mean by shared private governance in this situation is like homeowners associations, condo associations, those kinds of entities, right? So there's already some interesting sort of forms of collective land ownership that are implicated here in these adaptation questions. And so we dove in and looked more deeply at some of those kinds of entities to try to understand how are they already impacting vulnerability and adaptation, and how might they be tuned to do so more effectively and more equitably? So we look at condominium associations and homeowners associations. We look at land trusts and community land trusts, which are a little bit more rare, but also have a lot of promise. And then as we think about these questions, as we think about the future of the bay under these various sort of sea level rise conditions, one of the things we did is we sort of invented a little slice of urbanized bayfront and then imagined a couple of different property scenarios. So the first is that we're looking at here, the scenario A is under kind of conventional property conditions, which is again, property conditions dominated by this sort of rigid, sort of static, fragmented, and unjust property regimes. And we imagined, 75 years into the future, out to 2100, what do we expect the kind of how do we expect sea level rise adaptation to unfold along these sort of shorefront conditions? And what you see and what we expect is that you'll have a sort of highly uneven patterns of adaptation, right? So there's people who can afford to move away from the shoreline or to move away from the most vulnerable areas will either adapt in place or will move, and those who can't afford to will suffer the consequences and will suffer the deepest impacts from sea level rise and coastal storms. We also expect that, as we see right now, a lot of the discussions around adaptation on the bayfront, it's around kind of shore hardening, right? So how can we build levees and flood walls and pump drainage systems to deal with the kind of the bay margin treated as a sort of very fine spatial territory along the edge of the bay. And as we know from places like New Orleans, where I actually got my start in thinking about these kinds of questions, those kinds of solutions are deeply ecologically damaging, they're deeply socially damaging, and they have sort of some really problematic dynamics whereby you get kind of locked into doubling down and doubling down and doubling down on these kind of engineered solutions, and then eventually they often fail, right, to devastating consequences. And so we were interested in thinking through how could alternative property regimes start to enable smarter ways of adapting that are more flexible, that don't have those kinds of lock-in dynamics, and that are more equitable as well. And so we played out the same sort of scenario on the same slice of our invented bayfront territory, and we imagined, okay, if you had a community land trust that could begin buying flood-safe upland territories and preserving it for affordable relocation from bayside communities that are as they need to relocate. What if you established a rolling easements regime whereby gradually over time people were sort of encouraged to move away from the bayfront edge, and you could at the same time start implementing some sort of more ecologically sensitive flood mitigation efforts like these ecotone levees and really fundamentally thinking about the relationship between the urbanized bayshore and the bay itself in a more sort of dynamic way, where you allow the bay to enter into and reclaim some urban territory on the land side, but perhaps there's also opportunities to think about the way that we can inhabit the bay in more sensitive ways in particular areas that would be appropriate to that kind of condition. So then we also taught an urban design studio in the Department of City and Regional Planning where I teach, where I had groups of graduate students looking at 6 particular sites around the bay and trying to do this work of imagining both physical adaptation interventions that would enable these flood vulnerable areas to adapt to rising seas, but also thinking through the role of these kind of progressive property regimes in enabling those kinds of adaptations. And so we looked at East Palo Alto and Hunters Point, the Canal District in San Rafael, San Leandro and San Lorenzo, the Galenas Creek area, and the Oakland Alameda waterfronts. And so in each of these cases, the students were looking at existing conditions, existing kind of ecological conditions and social conditions and property conditions and questions of kind of equitable impacts from climate change and proposing a suite of strategies to adjust. Can't get into those today, but if you want to learn more, you can look at the report, and I'd also be happy to talk more about them. So I'll just close with some kind of summary and policy recommendations that we arrive at in the reports as well. So just to kind of reiterate, the fundamental issue here is this mismatch between the way we manage land together. We manage our sort of social relationships in land, which are rigid and fragmented and unjust, and that those are going to make sea level rise adaptation difficult, costly, and inequitable. And so we are interested in looking at all of these various other forms of land governance that exist around the world that might enable us to confront those challenges. We look at how those might play out in different places around the bay, and we see lots of opportunity. And we think this is a moment to begin kind of testing and strategizing and thinking more broadly about the role of property in adaptation. And so to that end, we have a few policy recommendations, including the kind of really making the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is this kind of unique regional environmental governance and planning institution we have in the Bay, a real driver of transformative adaptation. And what that would look like, so the BCDC has a sort of very interesting jurisdictional definition, which is a 100-foot bayshore margin. And so that's going to move as sea level rise comes into play more and more. And so we think that the BCDC has a really important role in sort of navigating a more dynamic treatment of the bayshore. We also, because we found that the sort of really surprising prevalence of HOAs and condo associations in these shared governance institutions, we think there's a real need to pay much more attention to the role of those kinds of institutions to make them better suited to both planning adaptation that will benefit their own members, but also to be more focused on what's happening outside their boundaries as well, to make sure that they're not sort of regressively reinforcing inequalities. And then finally, because so much of that sea level rise vulnerable territory is held in public and these sort of shared governance entities, there's a real need and a real opportunity to begin planning in partnership across jurisdictional boundaries and across these different types of institutions. And there's some seeds of this starting to happen in places around the Bay that are really exciting, but there's a lot of room to expand on it. And then lastly, I think really starting to look at these global models of more environmentally adaptive and more equity-centered property strategies, and putting some policy muscle and some public resources around testing out those different strategies and thinking through how we might encourage them here in the Bay. So I'll close there. If you want to grab the report, it's available online from Next 10. You can also email me and I'll send it to you, or if you have questions, I'd love to chat. And it's also at this QR code here. So thanks so much.
Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel, and I am 3 months into being a professor at Berkeley, and really excited to see you guys here today. So I thought I would start my talk today, and this is sort of a broad overview with a few shallow dives into research, but I wanted to start my talk with this image of kind of an idealized coastline that looks similar to some of the coastlines where I work. And if we imagine the kinds of climate hazards that can befall this coastline, if we foreground the ocean, for example, we might think about ocean warming, ocean acidification, sea level rise. If we focus instead on the mountains in the background and the cities, we might think about wildfires, extreme atmospheric rivers, drought, floods. And each of these hazards, especially in the coastal zone, I want to really kind of bring home the point today that each of these hazards affects the range of ecosystems that you see in this comprehensive image. I think oftentimes we associate each of these hazards with a very specific ecosystem, both in terms of imagining kind of, our kind of mental model of their effects, but also in terms of governing adaptation. And so wildfires we think of as affecting forests and cities, and ocean acidification, clearly the ocean. But all of these hazards are affecting these multiple coastal ecosystems in tandem. And so this is, in part because land-based processes, of course, flow into the ocean. And we can see this very vividly in this satellite image from NASA of the California coastline during December 2022. Many of you will remember that 2022 in California, we had these huge rainfall events. And personally, my basement flooded. And so during these big events, if I were to ask anybody in this room to draw the coastline, they might trace something like this. But during these events, land-based processes and activities created a footprint or a zone of impact that looked more like this. So we're here for ocean stories, but here we see that the land is very much a part of the ocean. And similarly, ocean processes, of course, affect the land. And these are often more obvious to us because, we are, as humans, primarily kind of land dwellers. And so when the ocean changes, we see it coming at us. We see sea level rise and storm surge. But I really kind of want to focus today on how new forms of resilience become available to us when we really center or kind of focus on the connectivity between land and sea. And conversely, investment in resilience tends to, in many cases, fail when we ignore this connectivity. So this is exemplified, it's been talked about for many years, but is exemplified by a study in 2012 led by Ben Halpern, who measured the effectiveness of a marine protected area in the Solomon Islands and found that it had this kind of effort that was quite, politically and economically even costly, at least in the short-term sense. It had limited benefit because it wasn't paired with conservation of a forest nearby, and the fishery felt the after effects of industrial logging. This is not a one-off. This happens around the world, and so we see that during climate stress events, coastal ecosystems that are kind of downstream of wastewater pollution and other local pressures tend to fare far worse, and ecosystems are more capable of bouncing back if there are kind of local level measures to control pollution. But more optimistically, I want to focus today on some research on how new forms of resilience become available to us when we kind of make use of this connectivity between land and sea. Starting with some cases of resilience, starting from land-based processes and then looking at their effects on the ocean. So a lot of my research tends to focus these days on how freshwater systems affect marine organisms, specifically under climate change. I personally I used to work at the EPA in the drinking water office, and then I became a marine scientist, and I was really surprised by how freshwater seemed to be viewed in the marine world, where often we talk about it as a source of pollution. So we tend to focus on these words highlighted in yellow: freshwater as a source of sediment runoff, heavy metals, petrochemicals, agrochemicals, harmful nutrients. But really, kind of more fundamentally, freshwater is a lever on multiple abiotic and biotic conditions that can be levers on climate stress. So some of those are highlighted in pink. Freshwater can increase or decrease local temperature at the coast. It can alter carbonate chemistry and therefore ocean acidification. It can alter salinity and food subsidies. I'll talk about those in a second. And then also support diadromous fish and give rise to mangrove systems that can generate microclimates that are beneficial under climate stress. And there is kind of mounting evidence that, it's been understood for a long time that freshwater supports organisms at the base of the marine food web. And there is mounting evidence that if organisms at the coast have a lot of food, they are better able to withstand climate stress. So ocean acidification and warming are very energetically costly, and in experiments, if organisms have a lot to eat, they sometimes exhibit positive growth rates and lower mortality, higher calcification, and a range of benefits. And so we see this in calcifiers like mussels, as well as corals. And so currently, my group is working on an effort to use new satellite data to map chlorophyll as a proxy for food subsidies, food availability at high resolution up and down the California current system, and then overlay these food maps with maps of climate stress, both thermal stress and ocean acidification, to see where this climate stress might be offset by high food supply. So some of those results are shown here, and the different panels just represent different seasons. But basically, all of the pixels here from gray to green represent locations in the ocean that have experienced a thermal anomaly sometime in the past 15 years or so, so above normal temperatures. And then the green shaded areas represent places where, at the same time, chlorophyll reached a level commensurate with kind of thresholds we see in experiments as benefiting organisms under the same stressful conditions. And so maps like this can help us identify places where we might see kind of food refugia and identify, places to kind of double down on conservation across land and sea. I won't go into this too deeply, but if you're interested in this topic, we led an analogous effort in the Hawaiian Islands using Planet Dove imagery to map freshwater plumes during an ocean heat wave, and then examined the effects of those freshwater indicators on coral bleaching. But for now, I want to pivot to how ocean processes affect the land during climate change. And to introduce this topic, I'm going to hopefully play this video focused on work led by the Nature Conservancy.
Hawaii's threatened coral reefs just got their first insurance policy against coastal storms. Non-profit organisation the Nature Conservancy bought it on behalf of the state, giving its reefs up to $2 million of protection until the end of December 2023. If it works, the first ever US coral insurance contract could become a model for defending reefs around the country. The Nature Conservancy says to date, conservation has relied mainly on philanthropy and government grants, but using insurance could help tap into the private sector. This is how the plan would work. Coral reefs that fringe developed coastlines can limit flooding by providing a barrier against ocean storm surges, meaning insurers have every interest in protecting them. So, if Hawaii experiences a storm strong enough to damage the reefs, the Nature Conservancy will get a payout from the insurance company. The policy covers the majority of Hawaii and will begin paying out at 50 knots of wind. Teams known as the Reef Brigades will use the money to recover reef fragments, store them, and reattach them using cement or epoxy. The idea of insuring coral reefs is not brand new. It was first tested by the Mexican state of Quintana Roo. Local tourism businesses and the government bought an insurance policy to cover their share of the Mesoamerican reef. Environmental group the MAR Fund later took out a policy in other parts of Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras.
It's like the first time I've ever tried a movie in a presentation and it's actually worked. So basically this video, as you saw, shows how corals are providing flood protection benefits during large storms to coastal businesses, and these businesses might therefore be motivated to pay into an insurance policy that becomes a fund for coral restoration during natural disasters. And so to support this work and try to scale it up, my colleagues and I led a survey of coastal businesses throughout the Hawaiian Islands to try to identify what kinds of businesses would be sort of early adopters of a coral insurance policy, and then also gauge how businesses perceive the economic value of coral reefs. I won't go really into results. This was published on Monday, so feel free to check out some detailed results there. But the basic upshot was that even in places where our external data sets and kind of floodplain models showed that corals have immense economic value to coastal businesses, many businesses in those areas read coral economic value as kind of low to moderate. And this was illustrated by a memorable quote from one surf shop owner who told me, I hate to say it, I love the corals, but you can surf on a dead reef. And so if more corals are lost, it won't affect my business. And that was a business in the floodplain that would be affected by coral loss, as well as tourism loss. And so this just sort of points to the invisibility of many economic benefits of reefs to certain coastal stakeholders, and the need for journalism and storytelling and additional communication about the economic value of ocean resources to those groups. If we can successfully engage the private sector in ocean restoration, this can have multifold benefits, not only by providing another source of funding for ocean restoration, but it also opens potentially creative legal pathways for putting pressure on the fossil fuels industry. After the Lahaina fires and LA fires, both California and Hawaii have introduced bills to allow insurance companies to seek damages from the fossil fuels industry in a similar way as the tobacco industry was sued for misleading the public about risks of smoking. And so if insurance companies are engaged in this way, this could sort of broaden our tent of allies for putting pressure on fossil fuels. So just to recap, overall, the benefits of synchronized land-sea conservation are not additive, they're multiplicative. They tend to be greater than the sum of their parts. And this is because of positive feedbacks between land and sea ecosystems at the coast. And so people who work on wildfires should look for allies working in ocean biodiversity. People who work on ocean acidification should look in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River deltas for partners. And there are many specific opportunities to do this joint work. Both of the states that I've kind of highlighted here in this presentation, Hawaii and California, have 30 by 30 plans. And if this 30% of terrestrial areas that are conserved in the future are spatially and ecologically coupled with ocean 30%, that can sort of lead to a situation where the benefits are greater than the sum of their parts. So that'll end there, but thank you for having me.
Now we're going to have a very short set of discussions on some of the themes introduced by all of our panelists here. Pretty amazing to just consider all the dimensions that have been introduced in these very short talks. We could have very long conversations with each of them about each of their points. So I'm just going to go very quickly. We have like 12 minutes or something to do a very quick round robin of questions. So one by one. Zachary, Mr. Lamb, Professor Lamb, sorry. We could have a long conversation about what it would take to reclaim land and all those very complicated maneuvers you would have to do to encourage people to leave the coast. But let's consider this question immediately. When I did a story about the effect of sea level rise in the Bay a couple of years ago, and one of the interesting things that somebody at BCDC told me was how frustrated they were that people, broadly speaking, in the Bay Area who don't live on the coast found it difficult to grasp the questions around the Bay. And so I would ask you that question is, why should people who don't live anywhere close to the coast, we're talking Danville that way, we're talking other towns, to our north, who don't live anywhere near the coast, why should they care and spend a ton of money to obviously protect the coast? To you, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure there are better people to ask that question to than I, but I think, a couple of the things that occur to me immediately are, as I mentioned, in terms of this quick analysis we did of looking at the land that's subject to sea level rise, particularly in Alameda County, and looking at the land use, the county tax assessors data on that. I mean, there's obviously, there are huge economic losses in terms of which will have serious implications for things like property tax revenue for counties, right? Which even if it's not your property that's being harmed or taken, it's going to impact you if other folks in your county are if you're having major property tax impacts from sea level rise. Also things like infrastructure, right? We have so much shared infrastructure that's in that zone along the bay shore, right? So from water treatment plants to highways, all of those sorts of things that we all use, whether you live on the bay or not, we all rely on that infrastructure. And so it's going to need to, we're going to have to think about adaptation in more sort of broad-based terms. And I think the other point is that even, if you live in Danville, you may not be impacted by sea level rise, but you're going to be impacted by extreme heat, right? So there's some kind of, to get at this question of the relationship between terrestrial and aquatic processes, and also just recognizing that every single person in California is going to experience some impact from climate change, and recognizing that if we just say, oh, that's your problem because it's on your land, it's not gonna cut it, right? We're all gonna have to kind of share this burden, and we can come up with much more creative solutions if we look across the various forms of impacts.
Yeah, interesting. He did say, just be aware that all the pipes that go from Danville end up on the coast in Oakland and that whole area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. Gladstone, sir. Very interesting to hear about Jamaica. Of course, you come from the one island nation in the group, which is surrounded by many of these challenges. So one of the statistics that you identified was the discrepancy in subsidies to fishing enterprises of 7 to 1. Mm-hmm. So essentially $7 equivalent to developed country fishing fleets versus $1 to Jamaica or other developing nations. So what would be the effect of changing that dynamic? Are there international organizations that are working in this particular area to kind of begin to change that dynamic, either directly when it comes to subsidies or to do better monitoring? Or what would Jamaica look to in the international community to begin to bring some equity into that picture?
Well, I guess at the time when I was doing the reports as well, there was advocacy being done on the parts of local, national fisheries groups, and also the people that kind of regulate the fishing industry locally. advocacy is being done. But yeah, it's the I guess the change, what it would reflect is that our local fishers could go further with less cost to them in a sense. And I mean that in the sense of, because some fishers out there, we have many reports of fishers being lost at sea, going out there being lost at sea because the gear that they have is traditional. It's like very traditional. So oftentimes they're navigating with things like just their GPS, or even before GPS, there were fishers who could read the sky and kind of figure out their location. So it would help to relieve some of the strain on things like that. But yeah, I think it's the gear. And yeah.
Great.
Hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you. And I know we're going very speedily here. A million follow-ups every each one I could have. But anyway, Dr. Carlson, I'm just curious. Obviously, you're very engaged with the land-sea dynamic. There is an organization that supposedly has some power here in the state that is exactly in this area, which is, of course, the California Coastal Commission. I was wondering if there are efforts, if you are aware of their efforts, or you're working at all with their efforts to actually address some of these questions you were talking about, the land-sea interface through the California Coastal Commission, which I assume people are aware of here.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of kind of threads that are interesting to follow there. I know that the 30 by 30 initiative from California, one of the priority kind of science areas to move that effort along is to understand how spatially and ecologically the 30% on the land and the 30% in coastal ecosystems can be better aligned. I think there is kind of like a high level recognition that it's beneficial and it has this kind of synergistic effect if that is well done. But I think, as I said in my talk, there are papers from 30 years ago that talk about the importance of this topic. I think it needs to be refreshed in terms of climate change specifically, but in reality, it doesn't happen very often. And I think that one kind of interesting thing that I've seen in entering this space is how I think a lot of the bottlenecks, there are some data bottlenecks that prevent it from happening in reality, but a lot of the kind of bottlenecks that I see around the world in preventing connected land-sea conservation is very human and governance related. We're very siloed in the way that we manage different ecosystems. And so I do think that there are some heartening examples in California specifically and in island nations to break down those barriers. But yeah, I'm excited to see what 30 by 30, how that unfolds.
Okay, well, you mentioned 30 by 30. At some point, we're going to want to hear more about the California Coastal Commission, how much power it actually has, and the efforts to limit it, I understand. But I know we have very little time, so I'm going to put one question to all three of you, and you can wrap it up. I think we have just a very few minutes. 3 minutes, exactly. Okay, perfect. So to each of you, the question of 30 by 30, big initiative, big concept, take 30% of the land and water out of commission from development point of view. So for each of your topics, and starting with you, and let's just move down the other way, Gladstone, why don't you tell us about how 30 by 30 is perceived in Jamaica, whether it's perceived as actually having a benefit to Jamaica, whether there's initiatives underway to provide those protections, and then we'll go in this direction from Gladstone. Just take a minute or so, Gladstone, to tell us about that.
Yeah, I think on a nation level, talking about the government, they do have agendas, and every different sort of political jurisdiction in the country, they have agendas for development. The 30 by 30 has become a part of that for a lot of places. Locally, I think the sentiment towards it, the public doesn't know a lot about it. It's a part of a larger development manifesto for the government. So the people that are more so aware are the people that are more involved, like the marine protected areas and that kind of thing. But it is having an impact because the initiative is allowing for more opportunities for support and that kind of thing for these places. And so, the people who are aware of them in those spaces are making use of them. And I think I'm seeing more of these things popping up as a result.
Cool. All right. Doctor?
Yeah, I think, I'm a little bit of a newcomer to California. I've, in the past, worked primarily in Hawaii.
They did a 30 by 32, I understand.
Yeah. So I think that it depends on what counts towards the 30%. And I would like to see, especially in this kind of land sea connectivity world, more support at various governance levels for restoring authority to community-based groups that are kind of trying to restore indigenous practices in Hawaiian fisheries. And there are some really, so in Hawaii, there are community-based subsistence fishing areas that have sort of increased over the last few years through some really arduous efforts by a few community groups throughout the islands. And I know that their efforts are to some extent limited or sort of bracketed by the jurisdictional the jurisdictional format of the state government, which is the colonial government. And so I think it's a little bit of if it's a state-led 30 by 30 definition that doesn't account for sort of pre-contact jurisdictional flexibility, then it can be limiting. But I would like to see...
That includes here in California.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And things like OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, if they are part of 30 by 30 accounting, I think that could...
What is that? Can you explain? Yeah, sorry.
So
OECM.
OECM's other effective area-based conservation measures are basically kind of non-MPA, non-TPA conservation areas that are often sort of de facto governed by indigenous and other community-based groups. And they, it's basically an effort to recognize that there are many places in the land and sea that are effectively protected, even if they're not called a protected area. And so, that we can go into
grandfathering in a way, like indigenous lands. Wow, okay, so many larger discussions. Everybody can come up to these people afterwards, as I would love to too, and just talk further about these details. But
yeah, very briefly, I'll just close out. And I know nothing at all about 30 by 30, so I won't even try to speak to it. But I will say that those sort of like quantitative targets, like high-level quantitative policy targets, can be really motivating and really valuable. I think that when it comes down to actually deciding where you're putting those conservation dollars, like I would just put a plug for kind of holistic frameworks that take into account considerations of ecological health, but also considerations of opportunities for urban infill development, because we need to be thinking about both the kind of adaptation and climate mitigation side, and how we can encourage more infill development in climate-safe zones where people can live low-carbon lifestyles, and also social vulnerability questions. And so we might look at models like the San Francisco Estuary Institute's Shoreline Adaptation Atlas that does really interesting work at looking at both at kind of these ecological questions and at the kind of urban infrastructure and social questions in tandem.
Cool. Well, thank you all very much. Obviously, they're around here. More questions to be had. And now we're going to move on to the next phase of this operation. Thank you to the panelists. Yay. Cheers.